Well, hello everyone. I am excited that you all are logging on. I am Ray Saldana, National President and CEO of Communities in Schools, here today as part of the 2021 Spirit Week celebration for our students and the network. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate, reflect, and to honor the young people that we've been working with this year and who will graduate or make it successfully to the next grade. But at the same time, we also want to acknowledge students who have taken significant strides to just stabilize or perhaps have even fallen behind due to the immediate effects of COVID-19 in their communities and the long-term impact of a long history of racial and systemic challenges that have surfaced for this moment of reckoning. But as we'll likely touch on today, even at the same time, backlashed in this moment to create actions that are intended to make the lives of our students and their families much more challenging. So last month, we honored the memory of George Floyd and reflected on the past year of racial reckoning that has really begun to lead to changes in our country's awareness and national conversation around the issues of systemic racism in education, law enforcement, health, and other institutions. And as I noted, in some cases, even created reactions, counterforces. Also in the last year, Asian Americans have been the target of verbal and physical assaults because of the misguided fears and harmful rhetoric about the origins of COVID-19 virus, those that have surfaced larger issues about the urgency and the challenges faced by one of the fastest growing minorities in the country. And while the struggle between these two communities, our Black and Asian community, and the activists within them creating movements for change, we believe that the time is now for these two communities to stand together in solidarity to really offer support and understanding for each other. The two sides can and must learn from one another, but first we need to recognize that there may be some differences, perhaps tensions that have long existed between the two communities. So in order for us to recognize these, we need to do so in order to move the social justice needle forward for future generations and acknowledge our differences and draw strength from our similarities. I'm excited that today we have two guests that are going to guide us in this important conversation, one in which I hope you, as an audience member, will stand in your identity proudly and with curiosity about the interconnectedness, both of our individual and collective fights for justice. As a first-generation immigrant with a father who was undocumented for most of my educational career, there is a sense of otherness or an independent struggle that we can feel, even a sense that we have to stay quiet and not call attention to ourselves or to our families. And we are finding that whether that is in the Latino, the Asian, the Black, LGBT community, and other marginalized groups, that it is only our collective voice that can truly make a difference. And at Communities in Schools, we are committed to being a part of a movement for systemic change at every level, so that one day every child will grow up in a country where they are celebrated for their diversity, feel included in our national institutions, and receive equal and equitable justice and treatment under the law. And here to help us kick off the conversation around the strategies to create equitable environments, especially those learning environments where we operate with our students, please welcome Dr. Isaiah Pickens, our National Communities in Schools board member. He's a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in young adults and the founder of iOpening Enterprises. And please help me welcome Cynthia Choi, the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, and most recently, the co-founder of Stop API Hate, an urgent mission to document and bring light to the rise in hate crimes in our Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Are you both there?
We're both here.
Yes.
We're here.
The moment of truth where technology either comes and greets you or tells you you've got work to do. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start just really by asking a question that can often just engender a knee-jerk reaction or response, but how are you both doing today?
You can go first, Cynthia. I'll go right after you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that wonderful opening and context setting. You know, it's very rare that I'm asked personally how I'm doing, so I will take this opportunity to say it's been a really tough year for so many of us, right? I think It's been a reminder, though, of the work that we need to do, and the importance, as those who are trying to provide leadership, as there's so many who are on the front lines, that we recognize that we're human beings that are directly affected by these issues, that mental health is important. And as Audre Lorde, I like to quote her a lot these days, has said that self-care is radical. Like, we have for so many years have been taught to sacrifice and to really put our own health last in terms of priorities. And the reality is this is a marathon. The work that we are engaged in is long-term, and the oxygen mask needs to be on us before we can really do this work effectively. And so I'm really excited about conversations we're having in our movement right now about healing, about restoration, so that we can be effective in this important work. So thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Cynthia, I feel like that's a great opening to how I'm feeling as well. Optimistic and exhausted. It has been such a hopeful year in some ways, in terms of the pain that we finally have begun to see, and to see the full humanity of people and what it takes to start the healing, which can be very uncomfortable at times and take a lot of work to sit in difficult and uncomfortable conversations that lead to difficult and uncomfortable actions. But I've seen the perseverance of people on the ground, people who are motivated not just for the good of themselves and their own family, but really seeing us being able to create a new narrative that not only supports our healing in this present moment, but really creates a trajectory that recenters and realigns our priorities, as Cynthia was sharing about our own well-being, our holistic well-being, but also the well-being of our communities, and how the two are interconnected. Because I think so often, especially in American culture, our individualistic approach to achievement, to being able to be outcome driven, can lead to the depletion that we all feel around the work that we're doing and where we're going, and sometimes lead us away from really being able to understand that we are interconnected and interdependent beings that really require a level of ability to connect and heal one another in the process. And so the work I do as a psychologist in this work is tiring, but also I get to see so many stories that show just how committed people are to making this movement not just a moment, but something that sustains.
Thank you, Isaiah and Cynthia, for really just setting the tone of this virtual room we want to create. It's our highest hope that those who are tuning in truly are, we hope, many of our staff members, because if I think about the rush of staff who are working with students who are dealing with trauma, who are dealing with the effects all around them, and come from the communities that we're going to talk about today, it's this level of care for themselves and openness to the harm that may exist that they can address that really allows us to jump into this conversation. So grateful. And want to begin really with a question that both you, Cynthia, and Isaiah can address. But I'll start with you, Cynthia. This is something I think that's called your work, it's called your mission, but since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, there's been just this huge uptick in the number of anti-Asian American hate crimes and violence and harm against the Black community. Can you share what this has meant to you, your work, your family, and for the communities that you... And Cynthia, I'll start with you. Sorry.
I'll answer the question real quick while it looks like some internet issues are happening right now. Can everyone hear me? Am I good?
Isaiah, I can hear you. If I broke up at any point there, I'm sorry, but I hope that I got a portion of the question out.
Yeah, you got the question now. And, I think a big part of, you got most of the question now. We know where we're going with this conversation around how do we start to be able to engage some of these communities. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ray, in any way, around how to really start much of this healing process and understanding really some of the historical context that really has shaped some of the pain that our communities and our families have been experiencing. And so, welcome back, Cynthia. I set it up for you. You want to jump in with your answer, and I'll come back. I was just doing the prelude. I'm the hype man. Come on.
You are, see what a great team we are. We're already showing solidarity. So apologize for that technical difficulty. So this is a moment where we as a nation are really reconciling and reckoning with our history of racism in this country. And I think it's important to stress that it's different for each of our groups in terms of our treatment, but the roots of how we are dehumanized, the roots of how we've been scapegoated comes from this notion of who deserves equal treatment, who deserves dignity and respect. And again, this is a period where there has been a surge of anti-Asian incidents. And I want to say our data shows that it's not, majority are not hate crimes, but they are despicable acts of discrimination and treatment. And without, I think, interventions, they will escalate. And so we see the response to address this issue as being multi-pronged, really centering on the need for ethnic studies, for education, to really address how the otherization, how social conditioning, how biases that we have with one another continues to be promulgated within our society. And so, you know, when I think about this time, I think about the fact that our community is speaking out. We're speaking out in the same way that we are speaking out against anti-Black racism, that we're speaking out against the hostile climate that we've created towards immigrants, those who are undocumented. And COVID, I think, has been an awakening in the sense that it's really lifted the veil of racial and economic inequality in this country. And so for me, this period has been an opportunity. It's been painful as it is, but it's also presented to us this opportunity that we can't go back to what we were doing before. We can't go back to thinking in the traditional ways in which we address all of our societal issues in the ways that we have before, through shame, through punishment, through our addiction to addressing all of our societal issues through our criminal justice system, through our immigration system, which arguably has been set up to prop up structural racism and to divide our communities. So in that way, as I think Dr. Pickens has really lifted up, it's been a painful period, but out of crisis, this has been a moment for us to really interrogate the ways in which we have to come together, especially in these times.
I completely agree with how you're framing this, Cynthia, in terms of the dehumanization that has been promulgated during COVID-19 and how we have to interrogate this moment. And part of the interrogation is really looking at how is power and resources shared. When we talk about the way that communities really have the resources and the power to manage a crisis moment such as COVID-19, what we saw were communities who were most vulnerable having the least access to resources, whether it be testing, whether it be opportunities to get treatment once they may have contracted COVID-19, or access to power to change their schedule. We saw so many immigrant communities who were essential workers having to go to work in spaces that weren't necessarily socially distanced, and then going home to communities or to homes that were crowded in some way. And this disproportionate impact on these communities who were already vulnerable was really magnified during COVID-19. And with that opportunity to see this impact, we also found an opportunity to highlight a road toward healing that I think really this movement following George Floyd, following some of these anti-Asian racist acts have been highlighted and illuminated for us. And part of that has been built out of what Dr. King talked about in terms of the moral rage that people are able to witness when they see these types of inhumane acts up close. And what I really believe we can do as a school community, as a nation, through CIS is really find avenues that address these systemic issues around racism, systemic issues around access to resources, systemic issues around sharing of power by one, being able to give our students a shared understanding of our accurate history and not a history that has been whitewashed or has been shifted to paint a narrative that secures the power of people who have been at the forefront of oppressing these vulnerable groups, and really illuminate not only the pain and the challenge that these oppressed groups have experienced, but also the resilience. Because one of the things I am constantly attempting to balance in these conversations is our ability to be able to identify the pain, identify the injury and heal it, but not over pathologize the communities that we're aiming to heal, and really be able to see that resilience and that strength and use that as a model for how we continue to move forward. And I think that's what we really learned during this COVID-19 pandemic. Not only the disproportionate level of pain and injury communities have experienced from lack of access to resources and shared power, but also the resilience and strength of people coming together collectively to create a new vision of what our schools and what America can look like.
Yeah, thank you, Isaiah. And as I'm sort of just picking up from there, it's that sort of new vision that we're assuming we all have an individual responsibility for. We're all members of a community, and for our work at communities and schools, working inside schools, it's creating a new vision for some of those structures, some of those systems. And I want to touch on this next question to pull from what you all have started to really grab at here, which is this concept of this dehumanizing effect. And I'm so glad you pointed this out, Cynthia. It isn't hate crimes necessarily that may be on the rise, although we won't know until those are either reported or some that go underreported. But it's these acts that sometimes can lead to harmful effects on students we serve, the communities we serve in. And so I want to pull Cynthia here. You did a recent interview with Comcast Newsmakers. You were quoted saying something I want to repeat here, which is the fact that we have preconceived notions about who's prone to criminality, the model minority myth, and all of the different ways that we otherize immigrant communities, communities of color, gender bias, all of these things are a result of the fact that we don't understand our history and that we are missing in history. So many may or may not know that Black and Asian solidarity can be traced through the history for decades. For example, there was the connection that Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X had as lifelong activists, community organizers, and friends who encourage each other along their journey of change. So can you both maybe share with us why it's important to understand the historical context of these two communities to better understand what is happening today, particularly with the youth and the communities that we serve? Cynthia, why don't I go to you first?
Okay, sure. So it is true, and I want to give credit to Helen Zia for coining the phrase MIH, missing in history. And I think the importance, since we're talking about the role of schools and educational institutions, that we understand, that history. And a lot of what I do is to highlight points of solidarity, including the fact that Frederick Douglass spoke out against the efforts to exclude Chinese from immigrating to this country, under the, based on the understanding that discrimination against one group would hurt us all. And so I think the history is really important, and there have been many examples of that that are really not understood. And so I think that is incredibly important. But also I think it's important to talk about the fact that, we can't sugarcoat the issues, that to talk about acts of solidarity, the ways in which our communities came together around common cause was difficult, because there have been so many efforts to pit us against each other. So when you think about the introduction of the model minority myth, you think about that was an accident. When it was introduced was at a time in which communities of color were coming together, were understanding the roots of structural racism. And it was introduced at a time to discipline Asian activists, Blacks, Latinx folks from coming together to suggest that certain racial groups were superior to others, through that to suggest that some cultures valued education and family more than others. And so that became an effective way to pit us against each other. And some members of our community subscribe to that. And so it's been a long effort to try to educate our own community about how harmful those racist stereotypes are. And the fact of the matter is that our community is so diverse. It really hurts our community to suggest that we are all the same, that we have the same immigration histories, to compare third, fourth generation Asian Americans to those who are refugees, who came literally with the shirts off their back, is a disservice, and it's harmed our communities in ways that are measurable too. The fact is that many of our communities are overrepresented in the prison system, and are also, the dropout rates and poverty rates are very high among some parts of our community. So these stereotypes, the ways in which we are pitted against each other, have real-time effects. And it contributes to racial resentment, and it contributes to this notion that somehow some groups are superior to others. And, you know, when I was, just to be personal for a moment, I was growing up with as a daughter of immigrants, you know, I had a very challenging relationship with my parents, because they developed stereotypes and notions about other people based on their limited understanding of people's experiences. And what I've come to realize now is, and you know, Isabel Wilkerson talks about this in her book Caste, and says, you know, immigrants come here and they quickly assess the situation, that there's a racial hierarchy. And so the question is, how do we counter that? How do we scramble these notions about who people are based on their racial makeup, based on their gender, based on their status here in this country? And so those are the things that I think where the school community can play an immense role. You think about the limited opportunities that we have to interact with people of different ethnic backgrounds and racial backgrounds. It's limited because of segregation. It's limited because of where people are locked out in terms of the workplace. So the school community plays an immense role in that regard.
I think your way of framing this is so important, Cynthia, for people to, one, understand the solidarity that has been historically a part of Asian and Black communities and Brown communities. Look at Fred Hampton and the work that he did in the 60s around creating these coalitions, and the power that created, that it made him a target by the federal government. And part of what we have to understand about historical context is a narrative that allows people to better understand themselves and better understand how they connect with the rest of society. And part of what people are always aiming at their foundations to find is a sense of safety and a sense of belonging. And when you create a historical context that others you, that dehumanizes you, it allows others to be able to say, you don't belong, and we don't have to care about your safety as much. In addition to that, it can lead to internalization of those beliefs. And so not only do we see a conflict arising out of a distorted historical context around the division between Black and Asian communities. What we also see is an internalization of Black and brown boys and girls and children of all genders who may believe I'm not smart enough to be able to achieve at this level because that's just not what we do. We, do sports, we do other things. And then on the flip side, you see Asian, Black and or Asian boys, girls, and genders, non-binary, thinking about I have to show up in this way to be accepted. I have to show up in this way to belong. I have to show up in this way of excelling academically in order for me to be valued in this community. And what it does is it constricts what everyone can be. And it really reduces our potential for what we can contribute meaningfully to society as a whole. And when we really start to understand the true historical context, which part of it is historical trauma, this cumulative wounding that has impacted all communities. And when we talk about the slavery of Africans in the US, we talk about the subsequent lynching of African Americans, we talk about Japanese internment, we talk about the genocide of indigenous people. It's these cumulative woundings that have shaped how communities find safety and find belonging. And when we create a historical narrative, a story that doesn't allow people to understand how they can truly connect and how they can truly achieve equity, which is that shared power and access to resources, then we're shortchanging our ability to truly reimagine the system like we're saying. And so one of the things I think is really important for us to understand as communities and schools and also as a nation is that the narratives that we are allowing our students to be exposed to, allowing them to grapple with, and I really do mean grapple with these histories, allows them to stretch and grow and bring their potential to the table so that we can start having people on the ground, students who eventually become adults contributing to society, who can start putting in place a more equitable system that really understands the potential blind spots and fault lines that our historical context created to perpetuate some of the oppression that we're trying to fight now.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say the reason why I believe our audience is resonating with this question and with this discussion is because they find themselves as operators inside a system. These are our site coordinators. And for reference, Cynthia, we're in close to 3,000 schools all across the country in different contexts, urban, rural, suburban. And what we find ourselves is playing inside a system against rules that are already built into not just the DNA of school systems, but communities and cities and legal structures. And it's finding our voice as an organization, knowing that we can operate from inside and push from the inside, bringing in the concepts of history, bringing in the lessons that you're talking about here, whether it's Isabel Wilkerson's description of this sorting that happens internally for us, and because we've got these certain scripts in our head because history has taught us as much. And I think it's this unteaching that's just been, I hope, really resonating with the audience who are advocates, who are supporters, who are staff of CIS. And so I want to zoom in a little bit to the US education system. I think that the history of US public education teaches us that it wasn't built for all students' needs. It really wasn't built for all students in its original conception. So this is not new, or it's even particularly controversial conclusion. So for some time we've known, evidence has been clear enough and visible enough for any reasonable person to see that the reality is in K through 12 public education, whether it's through intentional action or inaction, movements and policies that divest or underinvest or set up systems, they have a disproportionate impact or harm and have harmful consequences for students who are Black, brown, indigenous, or even just students living in poverty. Dr. Pickens, you've focused your career on understanding and recognizing how traumas like these can have a negative lifelong effect on youth and finding solutions. And we know, as your organization says, individual change is systemic change. So maybe I'd like both, and Cynthia, if you'll start, can you speak to the different ways we can care for and protect the young men and women who are witnessing, enduring, and internalizing these injustices that they face in school and even beyond?
Wow, we're actually going to talk about the design of our U.S. educational system. Such a huge topic, and I really appreciate it. Well, one thing I wanted to share is that we have engaged young people on this issue, and they have been clear about the fact that they want schools, the educators, the administration, the leadership to see them and to create learning environments that really see them much more holistically than their experience. And there's a real desire to address the fact that violence shows up in different forms. Yes, there are interpersonal forms of violence, but there's institutional that reinforces invisibility, the way that we deal with harm in schools through expulsion, rather than using these as teaching opportunities and addressing and building skills, life skills around conflict and peer mediation, that there was a desire for there to be more investments around those types of solutions. But one of the things that I feel is really important to lift up is that all of this is happening within the context of inequities within the education system. And so what we heard from our young people was that they want to be seen, they want to have concrete opportunities to work across other communities to address issues around inequality in the school system. So it's not enough to just talk about each other's history. That's one step. It's important to create spaces for dialogue, for difficult conversations, but also to address issues around discipline, around the effects of the harm that policies are having on immigrant families, the fact that Black communities, Black family members are experiencing daily trauma every time there is an incident, a death in the hands of law enforcement. The fact that there's been silence because of the fact that there hasn't been enough investments in equipping teachers and other support staff to be able to hold these conversations has been evident. And we've seen students speak out over and over again saying that this really has to change. And we have an opportunity to do that when most of the schools will be returning in person. So it's that report is actually on our site at Stop API Hate. And I think it's worth a read for those who are really interested in how we have these conversations. And the fact that our students are saying that they want to do this work with other students of color, that they don't see this as just an Asian issue, but an issue that hits so many of their peers. And it's something that I think is really inspirational.
Yeah, when we look at the U.S. history of the school system in the United States, one of the things we know is that Horace Mann and the Common School movement really was focused, that movement was focused on being able to create school systems that prepared students for the, quote unquote, real world, but did it in a way that focused on compliance. And when we talk about this concept of compliance and we move forward in history and look at the zero tolerance movement of the 90s and the extreme punishment and the categorization as super predators by of boys and girls and non-binary individuals, is this really, again, narrative that I'm coming back to that created policies and practices within schools that focus less on context and more on consequences. And it's that context that creates the lives that our students are living. And so when we talk about where do we really start to explore and understand how to create equity and really address some of the inequities that we've seen, all of the inequities we've seen in the school, part of where we need to start is where are the disproportionate experiences of young people of color that don't allow them to really get support, but also overly focus on complying with a system and a set of values and practices that don't necessarily align with what it is that they believe in or in who they want to be as they grow older. And just to put this a bit more concretely, we know that a couple of years ago, the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education did a report looking at disproportionate discipline of youth, particularly Black and brown boys in the United States. And what they found was that the disproportionality wasn't as much with the types of behaviors that you can measure, such as having a gun or such as with having drugs, but it was with more of those subjective types of discipline. A person felt disrespected, or there was subordination, or something where you had to make an interpretation to provide discipline. Now, what that tells us is that those who have power within the school system, whether they're teachers, whether they're administrators, have blind spots that really in many ways shape and create a filter to which they use to deal with and discipline and potentially promote students throughout the school system. And so when we don't address these really important areas of how our teachers and how our administrators and you as site coordinators are creating a culture of solidarity that's infused with compassion, seeing the humanity, seeing the whole of another person, what we're doing is we're missing out on opportunities to help young people, one, heal from the trauma that they may have experienced individually within their communities, heal from the collective trauma, historical trauma their communities may have experienced as a whole. And then also we lose out on opportunities for students to really be able to refocus their attention from having to protect themselves from systems and policies that constantly feel threatening to them, and really being able to redirect that energy towards reaching their academic potential. One of the speakers we had a couple of years ago is Raj Chetty, who's a behavioral economist at Harvard. And he has this concept called lost Einsteins, and pretty much says there's students who could cure cancer, but because of their zip code will never have the opportunity to. And so part of our journey is being able to create the social capital for our young people to be able to both empower them while also not losing sight of the broken and equitable components of the school system that overly focus on compliance and not necessarily focus on the growth and development of individuals, seeing them holistically, and being able to shift that so that we can really start to create that equitable system we're looking to create.
What I really hope that our audience who include staff here are hearing is not just the insurmountable amount of work that needs to happen, whether inside schools or with the students in the communities they're serving, but the amount of support that they can get, the unification that is possible when we're really looking at this work through this ecosystem that sometimes our students can't breathe in, this environment that suffocates them because of some of the perhaps perceived notions of adults. But really glad Cynthia lifted up the voices of the communities who have spoken and how they want to both be interacted with, worked with along this journey. And so I want to just maybe finish up with one question. And it's about something that I think allow you to speak to the work of your collective organization. Well, what has been true of COVID-19 is that it really has exposed a lot of these pre-existing conditions that we've been talking about around structural racism that have surged in the Black and the Asian communities. These are, in these communities, historically, activists have fought to eliminate a lot of the barriers that exist for each of our communities. But among the talk of solidarity, the presence of tension and mistrust between the two communities may remain. So both African and Asian Americans are reaching out across cultural divides. They're presenting a multiracial front to condemn the violence of the past 2 years in hopes of bringing about the unity amongst the two communities. So in the activism space, it's known that Black and Asian communities have been pitted against each other or to distract from the powerful structures put in place to oppress each one of the minority communities. So Isaiah, Cynthia, how can organizations like CIS and Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate work together to correct this tension and the inequalities our children face inside school and outside?
One of the areas that I've found is always an opportunity to build consensus and an opportunity to really help people work together is simply exposure. One of the things that these distorted narratives have created is a sense that the other, whether it's a Black person looking at an Asian person or an Asian person looking at a Black person, the other is in some way either a threat or not, does not have similar or shared interests with you. And so one of the ways that I believe CIS and several other organizations can really create this shared vision and allow for these opportunities to connect is by creating exposure to each other's history, each other's culture, but also creating opportunities for shared visioning of what this new equitable system may look like. And this can be something as simple as creating opportunities to share, students sharing their dreams about who they want to be, and not just connecting that to what they want to be abstractly, but talking about how those are connected to their core identities, whether it's their Asian identity, their gender identity, their Black identity, and really being able to provide that humanistic and that humane context to why they're pushing to support their family who may have immigrated here, or their family who didn't get a chance to go to college, but they're having that opportunity. And then on top of that, I think part of what the CIS and other organizations can really promote is being able to be a bridge between communities in a way that allows the communities to develop new narratives based on resilience. So often this fight is focused on what is the pain and injury that we've experienced, and it neglects just how strong these communities have been and how much stronger they are when they work in coalitions. And so, just as recently seen the story about Black Judas and the Black Messiah, to see a person who brought together so many coalitions and the power that came with it, and the way that power can at times counter and even scare the dominant power that has oppressed over time, can inspire young people, can inspire others to find more innovative ways to create that consensus building. And so by being that bridge, I believe these organizations can move this coalition and this solidarity movement forward.
Yeah, I really want to echo that. And also, I think what's really, really important from our experience is that you start with talking with the impacted folks, those who are directly impacted. So starting with the students and their families about what they need will be really important. And I think context really matters. I know that you're in many, many schools, many sites. And I think you start with what you have. So if you have core leaders, sort of indigenous leadership, natural leaders in the community who say, I want to be a part of something. I mean, dialogue is really important. I think it's a starting place, but it's not enough in my experience. There needs to be opportunities to work concretely towards something that will benefit, all the students and all the families. And so what I find is that you find that critical mass and you build from there. Again, starting with those who are most impacted. And I think, we sort of overlook the simple things. The relationship building, breaking bread together. And I know it's hard, especially when language barriers are there. And so maybe the idea is you start in separate groups, bringing together the students and families who speak the same language and have relationship with each other before you start to bring folks together. So there are natural steps. And I know all of you all know that and do that. But I think it's especially important during this period because so many are hurting. So many have such raw emotions and feelings and going to be coming together for the first time in quite a long time. So that extra care and attention to creating community with one another is going to be extremely important, especially now.
Cynthia and Isaiah, I want to just sort of conclude and really begin to thank you for this rich conversation. I know that each of you are always pressed for time and asked to speak to organizations and comment about your work and your expertise. But if this is a journey of 100 miles, it really is about the first step. And that first step can sometimes be difficult, especially for an organization like ours, where we're a nonprofit allowed to be in schools and wanting to push on what those systems can be to really dramatically impact or reverse some of the trends that most of our students who are students of color are facing. It can be difficult, but I think just hearing the inspiration, the struggles that you all have had going through your own organizations really lifts us up to consider what is possible and what we need to do to give ourselves permission to walk into this space with the kind of understanding of history and context, because I think what Isaiah said is correct. which is that, the kind of power structure, power doesn't yield easily, especially if that is a dominant power. But the young people we work with, if they're energetic, if they taught us anything over the last 12 months, and the site coordinators who advise them, it's that they're ready to meet that countervailing force that sometimes resists that change. So thank you both for coming today and sharing your candid responses to such a relevant topic that's weighing on the hearts and minds of a lot of our families who've been impacted by what's happened across the country over the last 12 months. And thank you all for watching today. I hope that you will be well, take care of yourselves. As Cynthia said, put your mask on, oxygen mask on first, to ensure that you can provide the love and care for others. And as always, to learn more about the work of Communities in Schools, please visit us online at communitiesinschools.org. And one more time, thank you to Cynthia and Isaiah for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.